proposals have been made, for example, raising the age, lowering the level of payment over time by indexing by CPI, or by reintroducing some form of income testing. Only raising the age meets the criteria I've outlined. With life expectancy continuing to rise, that seems to me to be inevitable. An initial phase increase with ample notice followed by periodic reviews seems the most sensible way to go and most likely to be accepted. The other two I think have little merit. Any significant reduction in the level of super will throw many elderly below the poverty line. Its political half-life would be under 3 years in any case. As for income testing, it did not survive the first MLP election. It would not survive a future MLP election because one party will undoubtedly make its abolition a condition for coalition. And I assure you, when you're a major party and you're presented with a condition like that, or sitting on the back benches for another 3 years, your principles rapidly disappear. The most fruitful avenue to explore, other than the age of eligibility, is to reduce costs without reducing the standard of living of the elderly. And that's an interaction between an enhanced KiwiSaver scheme and New Zealand superannuation. The Australian scheme is 9% of wages, soon to rise to 12%, all paid for by an employer payroll tax. It has been criticised for the fact you can take the lot in a lump sum, avoid the income and asset test, and indeed this whole decumulation problem is starting to create considerable debate within Australia. In New Zealand, we've got KiwiSaver booming away much more than anticipated. It may make many people more independent of New Zealand superannuation, but it doesn't reduce the cost of New Zealand superannuation, except tenuously through the taxation system. It is not a long step now to make KiwiSaver compulsory, but that the relationship between KiwiSaver and New Zealand Super becomes one for serious discussion. What I've done is done a little bit of modelling, where we assume a compulsory scheme starting in 2016 as people signed up from age 18, all remaining adults will be signed in by 1 July 2020, initial lifted contribution rates back to 4+4, then phasing up the employer contribution by 0.5% per annum to either 6 or 8%. And probably, though we haven't bothered modelling it because it makes no difference over the long term, starting new entrants off at 2% and gearing them up so that the transition is easier. The rules assume that all retired people continue to enjoy a guaranteed retirement income, at least equivalent to that in New Zealand superannuation based on the current formula. In other words, nobody receives less in the future when retired than they would do under current policy settings. And two basic ways of achieving this were explored. One was to say people would have to take half their KiwiSaver out by way of annuity, and then the rest will be made up to that floor of the guaranteed income if need be. But if you had more than the New Zealand Super, you keep the extra. So in other words, in effect, there is an income test, but delivered by means of topping up the KiwiSaver contribution. That may be difficult to establish and maintain an acceptable policy position, but it does have a substantial impact on long-term costs. And it has all the usual problems, of course, of applying an income test. But we look at what happens if we do that. The blue line is the current projection of New Zealand superannuation gross costs. The green line is rising with 6% employer contribution. The red line is an 8% employer contribution. The fiscal cost of New Zealand superannuation, or the guaranteed retirement income, actually vanishes by the end of the century on reasonable assumptions. But even by 2050, has had a very marked fiscal impact. So if you're looking at it from a purely fiscal perspective, that is the biggest bang for buck, which is around, is that kind of approach. The second was to say, to keep things actually easier than that, why not, I should say that this approach will only apply to the compulsory scheme onwards. Not if any savings up to the point of compulsion are not affected by this. So those who are already in KiwiSaver and join voluntarily are not affected. The second approach was to introduce a 10 or 15% accumulation tax, capital gains tax, New Zealand superannuation levy, whatever you want to call it, at age 65, that is at maturity of the scheme. And essentially to solve the problem on the revenue side by creating a new revenue stream to support New Zealand superannuation. And that has that impact, both as obviously four lines now, because we've got the 6% and 8% employer contributions, the 10% and 15% tax rates. What's interesting about that one is that it basically flattens out the cost of New Zealand super, fiscal cost of New Zealand super, over the remainder of the century from the initial rise. In both cases, there is an initial assumed rise in age to 67, and some further increases way out into the future, just for a matter of argument. Finishing as quickly as I can, that seems to be perhaps a more acceptable option than one which is very clearly an income test not too heavily disguised. If a capital gains tax is generally introduced anyway, this is not inconsistent with a capital gains tax kind of regime, and it certainly does not leave people worse off in the longer term than they were at the present time, but of course they're foregoing income in the meantime because of higher contributions to that. The third option, which I haven't, well, only occurred to me yesterday, is that in the increase of the contributions under KiwiSaver, part of that could be parked as a New Zealand superannuation levy and paid directly into the New Zealand superannuation fund. So that's a form of public saving as you go to offset the future cost of New Zealand superannuation. There are arguments for and against both the private versus the public savings-to-go options in that regard. In any case, the government is always exposed to some level of investment risk, whichever way it goes, but it's exposed to investment risk by the proxy of the economy in any case over the longer term. I mean, there's no way to get around that particular problem. I'm also suggesting that the payment from any levy should go directly to the super fund, and very good suggestions from my party of future policy, and that all remaining shares in SOE should be transferred to the New Zealand superannuation fund as well. It might not be some current debates.